For most Canadians, history begins with Confederation, or perhaps with the fur trade, the British conquest, or French colonization. But somewhere in the snow-covered chapters of this nation's past lies a truth too often ignored. Black Canadians have been here since the very beginning, and not by accident, but by design. Yet their presence, their struggles, and their contributions have been systematically buried beneath layers of silence. It began in 1604, long before Canada was a country. A man named Mathieu Da Costa, a free black interpreter, arrived with the early French explorers. His fluency in multiple languages made him indispensable in negotiations between indigenous peoples and European settlers. But where is Da Costa in our schoolbooks? Where are the countless black lives that shaped this country from its inception? By the late 1700s, thousands of Black Loyalists, formerly enslaved Africans, promised freedom in exchange for loyalty to the British during the American Revolution began arriving in Nova Scotia. They came with hope, carrying British documents that guaranteed them land and liberty. But what they received was something else entirely: rocky soil, racial discrimination, and broken promises. Birchtown, once the largest free black settlement outside of Africa, quickly descended into poverty. The government failed to deliver the land and support it had promised, while white loyalists were prioritized and protected. Worse still, many of these Black Loyalists faced violent hostility. In 1784, in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, a white mob attacked black residents, one of the first recorded race riots in North America. The promise of a new life had turned into a nightmare. Disillusioned, over 1,000 black Nova Scotians eventually left for Sierra Leone in West Africa, seeking the dignity that Canada had denied them. But Canada's quiet cover-up didn't end there. By the 1800s, Canada began branding itself as the final destination of the Underground Railroad, a safe haven for African Americans fleeing slavery. And yes, brave souls like Harriet Tubman did guide many to freedom north of the border. But this narrative, so often taught in isolation, conveniently omits what happened once those fugitives arrived. They weren't always welcomed. They were often segregated, denied employment, and kept at the margins of society. Some towns even passed local ordinances to keep black people out entirely. Still, against this tide of exclusion, black communities endured. They established churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. In Ontario, the Elgin Settlement and Buxton Mission became models of black excellence and self-sufficiency. These communities sent leaders, educators, and abolitionists into the wider world. Their descendants helped shape Canada's social and political fabric. So why aren't their names on plaques? Why aren't their stories part of our shared memory? Perhaps the erasure was deliberate. The quiet convenience of forgetting. The comfort of a sanitized past. It's easier to see Canada as the polite nation that opposed slavery and embraced multiculturalism. But that myth is just that, a myth, a distorted reflection of the truth. And the truth, it's darker, more complex, and far more important. Because within that silence lies the key to understanding not only the past, but the present. What if the legacy of exclusion still echoes in modern policies? What if the absence of Black Canadian stories in classrooms isn't an oversight, but a continuation of systemic erasure? The question then becomes, what else has been hidden? As the 19th century unfolded, Canada moved toward Confederation, promising a new era of unity and progress. But for Black Canadians, progress often came wrapped in prejudice. While slavery was officially abolished in the British Empire in 1834, the chains didn't vanish. They simply took new forms: school segregation, voter suppression, land exclusion, and economic discrimination. The myth that Canada was a haven of racial harmony after emancipation is a seductive one. But step into the dusty archives of Ontario or Nova Scotia, and you'll find municipal bylaws and school board minutes telling a different story. In many towns, black children were barred from attending white schools. Separate schools were established not as an act of cultural preservation, but as instruments of exclusion. These schools were underfunded, overcrowded, and ill-equipped. In fact, some parents protested by refusing to send their children at all, believing even limited education under segregation would reinforce their children's marginal status. Even in regions like Upper Canada, where prominent black leaders fought for justice, figures like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, a trailblazing publisher and educator, racism was woven into law and policy. In 1850, the Common School Act gave school trustees the authority to create separate schools for black children, codifying racial segregation in education. That law wasn't repealed until 1964. Let that sink in. For over a century, Canadian law allowed, and even encouraged, the segregation of children based on skin color. Segregation wasn't limited to education. Black Canadians were denied fair access to jobs and housing. Many were forced into menial labor despite qualifications and experience. In Nova Scotia, black communities like Africville were relegated to the outskirts of town, denied running water, sewage systems, and public services. Yet they still paid taxes. For decades, their pleas for infrastructure and dignity were ignored. Land was also weaponized. Black settlers were often given plots that were rocky, remote, and largely unworkable when they were granted land at all. Meanwhile, white settlers were given fertile farmland, often adjacent to roadways and water sources. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. And then there were the laws meant to keep black Canadians from participating in democracy. In several provinces, black men were denied the right to vote well into the late 1800s. Property requirements and other voter suppression tactics were employed to ensure that white landowners remained in control. Despite their loyalty, service, and citizenship, black Canadians were treated as second-class citizens, sometimes even stateless. Even public spaces weren't immune. In Ontario, theaters, restaurants, and swimming pools routinely turned black patrons away. In one documented case from 1914, a black couple was forcibly removed from a theater in St. Catharines simply for sitting in the white section. The police sided with the establishment. These weren't isolated incidents. They were Canada's version of Jim Crow, quieter, less overt perhaps, but just as effective. And yet, through it all, black Canadians resisted. They built newspapers, founded political organizations, staged protests, and ran for office. Their resilience was remarkable, but rarely recognized. Even now, names like William Peyton Hubbard, the first black city councillor in Toronto, remain virtually unknown to the general public. Why? Because Canada's history books too often choose silence over truth. As the country marched into the 20th century, this silencing continued. Racism evolved, taking on new forms in immigration policy, policing, and media representation. So what did Canada do when waves of new black immigrants arrived from the Caribbean in the early 20th century? It didn't roll out the welcome mat. As Canada entered the 20th century, the world was changing rapidly. Industry was booming, cities were growing, and immigration became central to nation building. But not all immigrants were welcome. For black people seeking opportunity in Canada, the gate was firmly shut or open just enough to send a message. You may be needed, but you'll never be truly accepted. In 1911, Canadian officials proposed an outright ban on black immigration. The language was chilling. The Negro race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. While this order in council was never officially enacted, it was quietly shelved due to public outcry and political maneuvering. Its intent was clear. Canada, while proclaiming itself a land of freedom and opportunity, was deliberately crafting a white nation. This anti-Black sentiment permeated every layer of immigration policy. Caribbean men and women, particularly from British colonies like Jamaica and Barbados, who arrived to work as domestic servants, laborers, or porters, were met with hostility and suspicion. Women who came to Canada under the domestic scheme were often subjected to brutal hours, meager pay, and racial abuse from the families they served. Men hired as railway porters, known as the sleeping car porters, faced degrading treatment, denied promotions, and forced to live in cramped quarters while on the road. These jobs were vital to Canada's growing infrastructure. Yet the men who performed them were rarely acknowledged in the nation's labor history. One of the most insidious examples of exclusion was the 1923 Immigration Act, often called the Chinese Exclusion Act. While it targeted Asian immigrants explicitly, its ripple effects empowered white officials to broadly restrict non-European entry, reinforcing a racial hierarchy under the guise of national security and economic stability. Black applicants, no matter their qualifications, were turned away or delayed indefinitely. Some were asked for impossible financial deposits or references from Canadian employers they had never met, making immigration virtually unattainable. Meanwhile, those who did manage to enter Canada faced an uphill battle. In the prairies, Black settlers from Oklahoma and other parts of the American South were given barren land and denied banking loans. Many lived in tar paper shacks through brutal winters. Schools in Alberta and Saskatchewan were segregated in all but name. In fact, in the 1920s, Calgary, a school trustee openly stated, "We have to prevent the mixing of the races in education." Local residents petitioned to keep Black children out of schools, citing concerns that they could not keep pace with whites. Even in Canada's urban centres, discrimination was the rule. Black Canadians were excluded from unions, restricted from renting certain apartments, and routinely passed over for jobs. In cities like Montreal and Toronto, ads commonly read, "No Negroes need apply." These were not relics of a distant past. Many of these practices extended into the 1960s and even the 1970s, and the media? It largely played along. Black Canadians were either invisible or caricatured, reduced to comic relief, criminals, or entertainers. News coverage of Black communities often fixated on poverty and crime, reinforcing damaging stereotypes. When Black leaders spoke out like Carrie Best, who founded the Clarion, Nova Scotia's first Black-owned newspaper, their voices were often ignored by the mainstream press. Despite these barriers, resistance never ceased. Organizations like the Negro Citizenship Association fought for immigration reform. Women like ViolaDesmond, who refused to leave a whites-only theater in Nova Scotia in 1946, challenged segregation head-on. Porters unionized under the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, led in Canada by figures like Stanley Grizzle and Lee Williams. They didn't just demand better working conditions, they demanded dignity. Still, by the mid-20th century, many Canadians continued to see racism as an American problem. The Civil Rights Movement was broadcast from Alabama and Mississippi, not Alberta or Manitoba. But Black Canadians knew better. They lived the contradiction, daily free in theory, yet confined in practice. And while resistance was growing at home, global movements were also shifting the narrative. African decolonization, Caribbean independence, and American civil rights lit a fire that spread northward. By the 1960s, Black Canadians had had enough. So how did this rising tide of activism collide with the myth of a multicultural, equal Canada? By the 1960s, the civil rights movement in the United States had become a thunderclap heard around the world. From Selma to Washington, D.C., Black Americans were rising in protest against centuries of oppression. Across the border, Canada watched. the national narrative still clung to the comforting myth. Canada was a haven, a sanctuary for the oppressed, not a country built on segregation. But Black Canadians, long denied their dignity, began to rise too, just not with the same televised marches and mass mobilizations. Theirs was an uprising in silence, rooted in everyday defiance. The spark came partly from new voices. The 1960s and 70s saw an influx of Black immigrants from the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America. These newcomers, many of them well-educated and politically conscious, challenged the established order. In cities like Toronto and Montreal, Afro-Caribbean students confronted systemic discrimination in education and housing. They weren't willing to accept that Canada was better than the U.S. if it still shut them out of jobs, schools, and leadership roles. One of the most pivotal flashpoints came in 1968 at Sir George Williams University in Montreal. When 6 Black students accused a professor of racism, the administration dismissed their claims. The students occupied the computer lab in protest. The sit-in, which lasted nearly 2 weeks, ended in chaos. A fire broke out, nearly 100 students were arrested, and the university's racial fault lines were exposed to the nation. For many Canadians, it was the first time they'd seen young Black people push back so forcefully and unapologetically against injustice on Canadian soil. But this was not an isolated event. Across the country, Black Canadians were organizing, forming advocacy groups, publishing newspapers, and building cultural institutions. In Halifax, the Black United Front took on housing inequality, job discrimination, and police brutality. In Toronto, the Jamaican Canadian Association became a hub for Caribbean voices and political advocacy. These organizations weren't just reactive, they were building power, community, and identity in a country that had long erased their history. Education became a major battlefield. Black parents and activists pushed for inclusive curricula that reflected their children's experiences. The push led to the establishment of alternative schools and programs like the Umoja Learning Circle and the first Black Studies programs in Canadian universities. Young people, too, began to adopt Afrocentric perspectives, embracing their hair, their names, and their heritage with renewed pride. Alongside these cultural revolutions came legal shifts. The Ontario Human Rights Code was introduced in 1962, followed by the Federal Canadian Human Rights Act in 1977. These laws, while imperfect, marked an important recognition. Systemic racism existed, and it needed to be addressed. Black Canadians especially, women like Rosemary Brown, who became the first Black woman elected to a Canadian legislature, pushed the conversation forward, demanding equity not just in law, but in everyday life. Still, resistance was met with resistance. Police violence, racial profiling, and employment discrimination continued unabated. In Nova Scotia, Africville, an historic Black community, was razed in the 1960s under the guise of urban renewal. Residents were forced out, their homes demolished, their heritage displaced. The trauma of Africville remains an open wound, a symbol of how Black lives and histories were deemed disposable. Media representation, too, lagged. Black Canadians were often excluded from television and film. When included, they were cast in narrow roles, never as complex, multidimensional people. In response, creators began telling their own stories. Filmmakers like Claire Prieto and Sylvia Hamilton began documenting the Black Canadian experience, preserving voices that had long been silenced. And yet, despite the pain and pushback, the movement did not stop. It evolved. It sharpened. Black Canadian resistance in the 60s and 70s wasn't about duplicating the American playbook. It was about writing a distinctly Canadian one. It was a resistance rooted in quiet rebellion, in strategic organizing, in the unshakable belief that Black lives in Canada mattered not just in theory, but in practice. But change, as history shows, is never linear. As Canada moved into the 1980s and beyond, new challenges emerged. Immigration policies shifted, urban ghettos began to form, and anti-Black racism adapted to new forms, less visible but just as insidious. In June 2020, as global protests ignited over the murder of George Floyd, the streets of Canadian cities began to fill too. Thousands marched through Toronto, Vancouver, Halifax, and Montreal, holding signs that read "Black Lives Matter" and chanting names like Regis Korchinski-Paquet, DeAndre Campbell, and Abdirahman Abdi, Black Canadians who died in encounters with police. For many, these protests were a wake-up call, but for Black Canadians, it was a continuation of a struggle that had stretched across generations. The myth that Canada has no racism, no history of slavery, segregation, or systemic inequality was finally being confronted in the mainstream. Books by Black Canadian authors soared to bestseller lists. Schools, government bodies, and newsrooms began hosting uncomfortable conversations. It was a long overdue reckoning, but this reckoning didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built on decades of activism, resilience, and resistance. It was the continuation of a legacy that stretched back to Chloe Cooley's screams as she was sold across the Niagara River, to the burning of Black homes in Shelburne in 1784, to the bulldozing of Africville, to the erasure of Black excellence from Canadian textbooks. This wasn't just Black history, it was Canadian history. The Black Lives Matter movement in Canada picked up where earlier generations left off, but with new tools and a louder megaphone. Social media platforms became modern soapboxes for the marginalized. Hashtags like #Black in Canada trended, spotlighting everyday stories of anti-Black racism. In schools, healthcare, policing, and employment. In 2021, Desmond Cole's groundbreaking book, The Skin We're In, opened many eyes to the subtle and overt ways systemic racism operates in supposedly inclusive Canada. Institutions began to respond. Municipalities apologized for past wrongs. Halifax finally issued an apology for Africville. Statues of colonial figures were removed or challenged. School boards started to revise curriculum. But while symbols were being addressed, deeper structural change proved harder. Police budgets remained intact. Black Canadians continued to be overrepresented in prisons and underrepresented in positions of power. Still, progress has come, even if slowly. Black communities are building their own schools, museums, and archives. The Ontario Black History Society and the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia have become hubs for education and remembrance. Younger generations of Black Canadians are reclaiming their stories, pushing back against erasure, and demanding to be seen not just as victims, but as builders, innovators, and leaders. The 2020s have also seen a surge in Black excellence being celebrated. From the arts to academia to politics, Black Canadians are making their mark. Michaëlle Jean became Canada's first Black Governor-General in 2005, and today, figures like journalist André Domis, author Lawrence Hill, and scholar Robin Maynard are shaping public discourse in powerful ways. Yet one question lingers. Why are so many Canadians still unaware of this history? The answer lies in decades of systemic neglect, in classrooms that skipped over Black contributions, in media that spotlighted Black trauma but not Black joy or resilience, in a national identity so fixated on being better than the U.S. that it refused to examine its own sins. But that is changing. Schools are finally including units on Black Loyalists, the Underground Railroad, and the destruction of Africville. Museums are curating new exhibits, and most importantly, ordinary Canadians, Black and non-Black alike, are beginning to ask better questions. Who gets to tell history? Whose stories have we missed? What do we owe to the people erased from our national memory? The truth is, Canada's Black history was never truly forgotten. It was silenced. But silence doesn't last forever. It gets broken. By voices in the streets, by stories passed down through generations, and by movements that refuse to be ignored. Today, we are in the midst of that breaking. And as we rediscover the stories schools never told, we find not just pain and injustice, but pride, resilience, and power. The story of Black Canadians is not just about what they endured. It's about what they built, and it's time all of Canada knew it. Because history, real history, belongs to all of us. And the story of Black Canada is, without question, the story of Canada itself.